Hey everyone, it's Reed. Before we get started, I need you to go to SezUs, SEZ.us, and sign up for the social media network for sanity. It's not left, it's not right, it's just normal, and it belongs to you. You only see the people you want to see, you only hear from the people you want to hear from. It belongs to you, your information belongs to you. We hope you'll sign up. That's SezUs, SEZ.us. And now, on with the show. Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm joined by David Rothkopf, host of the Deep State Radio podcast and the Deep State Radio Daily, and he's CEO of the Deep State Radio Podcast Network. He's also a columnist for the Daily Beast, publishes the Substack newsletter Need to Know, and is the author of 10 books and countless articles on the topics of policy, politics, and national security. Today, he's coming to us from the Washington, D.C. area. David, welcome back.
That's good to see you, Reed.
This is from one of your more recent Substack posts. I just want to read this as we start our conversation. Quote, most of the current leaders of the so-called opposition in this country do lack courage and a sense of urgency. But perhaps most worrisomely, they also lack imagination. They can't see that the crisis we are in flows from the vast majority of Americans in both parties being grossly dissatisfied with the status quo. And they don't recognize that if one party's solution to that is to go backwards, far backwards, into dark chapters of our history, the natural role for the other party should be to seek to move forward. Worse still, they don't dare discuss the changes we are in dire and desperate need of discussing. They don't even want us to discuss it. Raising such questions is, after all, as we have established, sacrilege. But then again, all progress, real progress, requires sacrilege. Do we have the fortitude and vision and creativity to go there? Or will we, as so many fallen great nations and empires of the past, collapse under the weight of our untouchable ideas, our unchanging traditions, and our too venerated institutions? Now, David, your piece, the reason why I wanted to get you on the show is because, it scratched every itch I have, philosophically, politically, realistically. And so give everybody a sense of what you mean by that. I have my sense of it, but share with the audience what sacrilege you're talking about.
Well, it's just there are a number of subjects in the United States that we can't discuss. If you say, is capitalism unfair to the average person? The minute you suggest that there's something wrong with American capitalism, you're un-American. And yet inequality has been growing dramatically for the past 40 years, and the average guy feels screwed. Donald Trump said, hey, you feel screwed. I can fix it for you. Of course, his formula is not going to fix it for them. It was a lie. And also what he's trying to do is appeal to people's dissatisfaction by saying, well, let's go back to when it was better. And, in some cases, that's the 1850s. But what we really should be talking about is how do you make a system that creates more opportunity for more people going forward in the new world that we're part of? Another one is, the Constitution of the United States has some parts that are broken. It gives too much power to states that don't have a lot of people in them. And the rules of the Senate are broken. Filibuster shouldn't exist and so on. Well, if you say that, then people say, well, don't you believe in the founding fathers? Well, first of all, Trump's solution is to say, I love the flag, but I'm going to blow up the Constitution, by the way. But ours has got to be, how do we fix these things? How do you make an American system that functions better? Trump's solution to fixing the government is blowing it up. The real solution is what's working, what's not working, how do we fix what's not working? And yet you can't have a lot of these discussions because if you raise these issues, it's seen as sacrilege. And it's time for a little bit of sacrilege. And, the other problem, finally, is that a lot of the leaders within the Democratic Party are saying, hey, let's go back, not 200 years like Trump wants to. Let's just go back to the good old days of Joe Biden or the good old days of Barack Obama. And that's incrementalist BS. The problems that I'm talking about existed back then. And part of the reason that Trump got in post-Obama and post-Biden is that we didn't go far enough to fix them. We didn't have a prescription that was appealing enough in the face of the lies that Trump was selling. But, a lot of Americans spend their whole life believing things that aren't true.
Well, that's not just Americans, that's humanity in general.
Well, yeah, it is. One of my few deeply held philosophical beliefs is that the vast majority of what we believe to be true isn't. And I think that sort of helps one guide through this. Most of the history we know isn't true. Most of the stories your parents told you about you growing up probably are not completely true. Much of what we believe about science is not true. I suspect you were growing up, and at some point they said you shouldn't have salt, and then they said no, you can have salt. And then they said Pluto's not a planet. And then they said no, actually Pluto's a planet. So a lot of the stuff we know isn't true. Uh, that's relevant in this case because one political party here is selling lies so that they can say anything they want. It's an old totalitarian trick. They're waging a war on knowledge in this country that like we've never seen before, on universities, on schools. Today, the day we're taping this, the president's going to sign an executive order getting rid of the Department of Education. And this is also war on free expression, war on the media, and so forth.
So there's a couple of things I want to unpack there. Is that following the Soviet invasion of Poland, they deported something like 40,000 officers, elites, senior bureaucrats, and academicians to the Soviet Union. They ultimately executed them in the Katyn forest. Um, Trump is doing the same thing in practical terms without the bullets, right? He's destroying the bureaucracy, he's destroying expertise, and he is going after academia, right? This is also not a new thing, right? Which is get rid of the people that do the work, get rid of the people that do the thinking, get rid of the work that can happen that is against your ideology or against your vested interests, whatever. The second piece of this, David, is this idea, I think, that you bring up is maybe the system should change, right? Like the Constitution is an incredible document. It was allowed to have amendments, right? The idea that it was a changeable idea. But of course, in the practical aspects of today, that's nearly impossible. Unless you have a well-funded, well-orchestrated event that probably could only come from the right at this point. But I want to say one thing is that, you use this word a lot, belief, right? And I think at its core, you can dislike the Republican Party and Trump and MAGA and all you want, but like they have a belief system. Now, it's chaotic, it's incoherent, it's contradictory, but it's all to one point, which is power. The Democratic Party, in my estimation, as I've spent the last few years thinking about this, is it doesn't know what it believes. It can't figure out where it wants to go. It can't figure out what it wants to do. And the problem is that in place of belief, I think, to your point about the yawning inequality and, the in-state Ayn Rand place we find ourselves in, is that for a lot of people, they're happy to throw culture war or fight culture wars with Republicans because so many vested interests are happy to have you and I fighting over the scraps, while to your point, the average guy is getting screwed. And remember, back in 2015 and 2016, the argument that was really compelling was Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. Sanders saying the same thing in the major key, Trump saying the same thing in the minor key. You're getting screwed, and everybody goes, we know. And then when offered, right, again, the Democrats chose the status quo over radical change, and radical change won.
Yeah, look, I was a member of the Clinton administration, and I went out and promoted those kind of third way ideas of the Clinton administration, and it was effectively Reagan light. And I've spent the past 30 odd years watching what happened when, we got rid of Glass-Steagall and we, created internet rules that let internet companies not be responsible for what the content they were putting out there was. And we created a lot of the conditions for this. And I realized we were wrong, that the answer was not compromise with Reaganism. The answer was trying to come up with our own solution to these things, as you've just pointed out. The problem is that this impulse of compromise of some people who are leaders in the party worked poorly with Reaganism in a day of traditional politics. It works terribly in an era when the other side is fascists. When the other side's trying to destroy the government. What are you going to say? Well, we'll meet you halfway on tyranny, Don. That's where they are. And the other thing is that they're sort of self-hating Democrats. It's interesting because the agenda that I associate with Democrats, which by some definitions of progressive agenda, is we need a fairer tax system. We need to reform our education system. We need to protect the environment. We need to ensure that there's opportunity for everybody within our system. We should probably give everybody health care in the United States like the other 34 OECD countries in the world do. And we're the only one that doesn't. We should probably have rational gun control laws. Well, what I've just described are a bunch of positions that are backed by 75% of the American people. And yet, Democrats are like disowning this as opposed to saying, look, the positions of Donald Trump and the far right are embraced by maybe 15 or 20% of Americans, and then there's another 15 or 20% that are carried along in their wake because they don't really know, and they're saying, okay, I'm going with those people. The views of the Democratic Party, which are fundamentally progressive views, and I know that's a charged term, I'm using it with a small p, those views are the views of the vast majority of Americans. So there's a great opportunity here if Democrats will simply own it and say, look, we're undergoing the AI revolution. The world is changing. We have to adapt. Finally, apropos of your point about the Constitution, there was a debate back when the Constitution was being written in letters and conversations between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Thomas Jefferson said the Constitution should only have a limited duration because what we predict now, it can't possibly be relevant in 50 years. And Madison said, no, we'll put in this ability to amend it. And for much of our history, the ability to amend it was kind of the genius of the document. It was never finished. It could always be updated. The problem is that also within the Constitution was this idea that less populated states should somehow have the same amount of power as more populated states. And the consequence of that has led us to a point now where it is absolutely impossible to amend the Constitution because the percentage you need to get approval across the country.
So I want to play a clip from Ta-Nehisi Coates in a conversation he's having with Joy Reid just last week. Rob, can we go ahead and roll that?
And let's think about this party since 1992. You lost affirmative action. You lost a woman's right to choose. Labor is under siege. You have lost the environment. Public schools are, effectively taken as, playgrounds for the private. You lost campaign finance reform. You lost the Supreme Court. You may lose Obamacare, which itself was a conservative compromise. What did this get? What did you win? Like, what did all of this strategizing and all of this, deep knowledge about, what did you ultimately win? And so when you start looking at it like that, and then you see the same people who have led you to this loss, Bill Clinton being deployed to Michigan, to do what? Liz Cheney, who has, she showed great courage, but has a constituency of 0, apparently. What are we doing here? So you don't have the tactics, you don't have the strategy, you don't have the morals. So what do we have then?
So David, to your point, here we are 30 years on, and all of the things that Democrats publicly espouse as things they care about, right? That billions upon billions of dollars have been spent on in campaigns and think tanks and efforts, and millions of people have dedicated lives and everything else to. You lost everything, right? So, was it rank incompetence? Were these things that kept the rank and file in line, but you didn't really care about? Because to me, back to your point, if Republicans have a 75% issue, we claim that 8 billion people and those people on Pluto all believe in it, right? If you guys have a 75% issue, you're like, I don't know, should we talk about it? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Look, you're a sensible guy and it should make sense, and it doesn't make sense. And we've The other thing is that the Republicans for the past 40 years have been extremely organized in saying, we're going to go after legislatures, we're going to go after the court, we're going to fund this stuff, we're going to have party discipline, we are going to not play by the rules whenever we have the opportunity not to, Mitch McConnell and court approvals and so on and so forth. And the Democrats have been saying, well, we'll play by the rules. That will, we'll take the high road. And, Michelle Obama famously, when they go low, we go high. Bullshit.
Right. Even she got over that.
Yeah, right. But like, not that her impulse was wrong, but the reality is you got to fight who is in front of you. You've got to deal with them in the way that they need to be dealt with. Now, we do have one advantage right now, and that is that because of the failures of the Democratic Party leadership over the course of the past several years, decades, we now have a Republican leader who is going to do everything that they said they were going to do. And it's going to turn out real bad. When you start cutting Medicaid, which 77 million Americans depend on, when you start cutting Medicare, they're already firing Social Security workers. And they've said, if you've got a claim on Social Security, you can't do it on the phone anymore. They're firing 80,000 Veterans Administration workers. People are going to die because they're doing it. They're getting rid of funding for science, as you talked about earlier, at NIH, at the National Science Foundation, at Center for Disease Control, at all these places. And what's going to happen? People are going to die. People are going to suffer. The tariff plans they've got are going to make prices go up. I could just go on and on. The point is, there is an opportunity for Democrats right now because the Republican agenda is proven to be a lie in the service of a few billionaires and at the expense of everyone else.
So let's talk about that. The thing that I assume prompted you to, either you were already working on this because it's a pretty expansive piece, or maybe it sped up your thinking on it, was last week, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer surrenders to the Republican majority. He and 9 other Democratic senators. He's now been on this quixotic tour, mostly of Chris Hayes. And I appreciate Hayes for being open to having the man, but also pushing back respectfully on him. And so if, to your point, like if you have an opportunity, I looked this up. Chuck Schumer went to Harvard. Then he went to Harvard Law School. Then he ran for elective office in 1974, a place he has never left since, David. He has been in elective office longer than I've been alive, right? And so I'm not being charitable here. Maybe it's an impossibility for a man that cloistered, right, that removed from what I would call the real world, to have any ability to operate in the world in which we live now. Secondly, all of those things that you talked about, that Coates talked about, they are all massive issue areas of importance, right? Which I assume Schumer was on the right side of. But to your point about something like Glass-Steagall, in the 80s, he writes this is a terrible idea. In 1999, he says we need to innovate. We need to have capital markets and financial institutions being able to innovate. And where do we get, right? So you'll forgive me if my cynicism takes over and says, actually, there's a really good chance he got a call from some people, north of where you live saying, you're not going to tank this market. You're going to make this happen, whether you like it or not.
Well, also there was a trend. There's a little known story that took place in December of 1993 where Bill Clinton was in Little Rock and he was having cabinet members come in. And he had Will Warren Christopher with him, who had been his campaign chair and who ultimately became Secretary of State. And he decided he was going to make Bob Rubin of Goldman Sachs the head of the National Economic Council. And he called his wife downstairs, Hillary, and said, I'm going to make Bob Rubin the head of the National Economic Council. And Hillary said, oh my God, we're going to turn into them. You are making a huge mistake here. So there were people who said this is going to head us in the wrong direction altogether. And of course, Bob Rubin was part of Wall Street. Chuck Schumer's primary source of funding is Wall Street. Chuck Schumer, Bob Rubin. It's a New York financial center driven kind of viewpoint. And frankly, I was out there. I was Deputy Undersecretary of Commerce. I was acting Undersecretary of Commerce, and I was going, this is good. Rising tide will lift all boats and all this kind of thing. But as it happened, it was wrong. Schumer has had a long, distinguished career in public service. I hate to tell you that one night in 79, I was in a diner in Brooklyn because I was an aide to a congressman named Steve Solars. And Steve Solars had a protege in the state assembly named Chuck Schumer. And Chuck Schumer, we sat in this little diner and we talked about Schumer's, and it was very clear he was so ambitious. He had already stolen a bunch of Solar's staffers. He would later go on to stab Solar's. I mean, he was like a shark, he was just like, I'm moving ahead, not with terrible instincts for the time, but it was clear what he was all about. He's too old for this job. I'm sorry. I don't mean to sound, ageist, but sometimes people are too old for the job. Joe Biden was too old for the job. Donald Trump is too old for the job. Donald Trump is losing his marbles. We can't
In real
say
time.
it in real time, right? He's like a crazy old man. I want to take over Canada and we're going to take over Panama. And it's like, are you friggin' kidding me? So maybe the Democrats could start by being smart. And by the way, as a perfect example of somebody who gets the gestalt, who doesn't have, who's also older, Bernie Sanders got it. Elizabeth Warren got it, but they're also too old to lead the party. So let's move on to people who've actually got a stake in all of this. I'll make one last point of that. Trump has got an administration of billionaires, by billionaires, for billionaires. Nobody in this administration will ever feel any of the effects of the decisions they make, nor will the millionaires in the Senate. You shut Social Security, they won't feel it. You shut Medicare, they won't feel it. You shut the Department of Education, or you do some of this crazy shit, they will not feel it. They're out of touch. Elon Musk wants to go to Mars. I got news for him. He's already left this planet. He is not in touch with the rest of our lives. And we need Democrats who are in touch. And one of the things that means is we need Democrats who are young enough to be in a position of responsibility when the chickens come home to roost, when there are consequences. So they have to live with those consequences. I don't want a pilot on an airplane that I'm flying who believes fervently in the afterlife. You don't want one who thinks it's going to be better if they hit the mountain, right? You want somebody who wants to land the plane and continue on with their life. And that's what we want, is we want people who are in touch, who are going to be around, who can be held accountable, who will own who they are, who will look forward. And frankly, we don't have it. It's not there. The Democratic Party does not have anybody up front who's doing that, except maybe AOC, Jasmine Crockett, Jamie Raskin, some folks like that, but none of them are allowed to be the principal voice of the party.
Let me ask you this. I was having breakfast with a friend of mine yesterday as we were recording this, and something about what you said, resonates with that conversation I was having, which is we need to understand what comes next. To your point about these chickens coming home to roost, right? When that happens, right, it's going to take years to rebuild. And when I say rebuild, I don't mean rebuild what we have, but to build the next thing. Because to your point, the things that he is doing, that Trump and the Republicans are doing in these first few months and in the coming months and years, will take years to fix. And they won't be fixed by just the nostalgia of saying, well, USAID is gone now, we're going to put it back the way it was. Like, no, you're not. You're not going to do that. And if you could, would you? Right? So my question is, like, how do we get to the place where you say, yes, we have to fight where we can strategically in these times. We have to fight where we can tactically in these times. But we also have to have a lot of thinking that says, what do I want the world for my kids to look like? And how do I build that? Because to your point, like, I'm part of the problem, right? We're part of the problem. Like, I don't want my daughters to have to live in this world, right? What are we going to lay the framework for so that when this does inevitably collapse, whatever that means, and that could mean Trump dies. It could mean Vance leaves. It could mean anything. But it also could mean that the constitutional republic as we've known it ends. So what are we going to do to prepare for that worst of circumstances so that when the time comes, somebody worse doesn't come along and fill the vacuum?
Well, I mean, essentially, what you're saying is we somehow have got to figure out how to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yes.
We need a political strategy to defeat these people. Every time we need to say, how do we beat them? We need to figure out how you use the CR to beat them on the budget. And we need to figure out how we use 2023 or 2025 to beat them in 2026. And then we need to figure out how you beat them in 2028. And if it's a congressional election, then it's 435 different campaigns because everything is local. And if it's a national election, it's something else. And if they're using new media and we're not, we need to get with the program and we need to have a plan. But of course, once you get in power, you also have to be able to govern. And so you also have to have an agenda. For example, national security. I'm a national security guy. I was the editor of Foreign Policy magazine. I look out and I say, this is generations to fix. Who's going to trust the U.S.? Who's going to trust a U.S. that goes Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump? They don't know whether we're a reliable partner. That's going to lead to other things. They're going to say, well, we lived under their nuclear shield. We can't trust them. We have to build our own nukes. Poland's already saying that, right?
And it's only a matter of time before the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians do too.
And other people elsewhere in the world. There is some damage we will never repair, right? USAID, the Times did a great story. 3 million people will die from the actions that was taken against USAID. They're never coming back. But how do we regain our influence when China will have stepped in for the next few years and started writing checks and saying something different? It's going to take decades. We need to plan for that. We need to figure out what the government looks like. Do you rebuild? Where do you rebuild? Do you rebuild the Department of Education? Do you rebuild EPA after it is being gutted? We're going to have answers for those questions. And we're going to have to not just do remedial post-Trump reconstruction, we're going to have to build for the new era. How do you deal with the huge dislocations in jobs that are going to come from new technologies? How do you deal with the fact that new biotechnologies are going to have people living 10 or 20 years longer, and our system is not designed to deal with that? How do you deal with the competitive situation around the world and the fact that our students are not prepared to deal with that? I hosted a dinner of a bunch of leaders in the Democratic national security community the other day, and they were all very thoughtful, and you would recognize a lot of their names, and a lot of them said for perfectly wonderful things. But when one of them said, we have to think about worst case scenarios, the rest of them were like, yeah, but I want to talk about NATO. They were like talking about their policy brief. They weren't thinking about the worst case scenario. And even when this guy said, I want to talk about worst case scenarios, what I thought was, we're in it. Judge Ludwig, this conservative judge said, we're in a constitutional crisis. They're behaving like tyrants. Trump is a despot. The rule of law is being ignored. And so one of the objections I have to Schumer, who, said, well, we got to go along with this continuing resolution because they could do bad things if there were a government shutdown, and we'll get to it in 6 months, is, are you paying attention? They're doing bad things right now.
Right. So, Rob, let's go ahead and play that clip of Schumer on the Chris Hayes show.
If democracy is at risk, that's a little different than what we're talking about now. Even a shutdown, as horrible as it is, we'll all have to stand up and fight back in every way.
I think actually this is useful because I do think, like, just in a genuine sort of good faith way, that there's a lot of people, and I think I probably count myself among them, who think that that's where we are right now. Well, that the plan being deployed right now.
You may be right. I don't think so. We're there. I think
you think we're not there yet.
Well, I think we're getting there, and we have to be really
vigilant. So Chris may be right, David. Like, this is what I'm talking about. Like, I mean, God love the man. Right. But like, what color is the sky? And like, do the purple squirrel people talk to him when he gets up in the morning?
I mean, it's just like he's out on a TV campaign tour to say, no, I'm the man for the moment, that proves he's not the man for the moment. Time has passed him by. He is out of touch. We are in a crisis. Even Chris Hayes tiptoeing around. Somebody should have slapped him across the face and said, dude, pay attention. The president doesn't listen to the courts. He wants to impeach people who oppose him. Yesterday, they stopped a woman from coming to the United States. They took away her visa because they looked at her phone, and in her phone was criticism of Trump, and they said that was an act of terrorism. The Attorney General of the United States said protesting at Tesla's is an act of domestic terrorism. This is police. They had called the police to break in to an independent agency, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and they sent everybody home. That's contrary to the Constitution. The president doesn't have the power to shut down the Department of Education. The judge said you have to undo everything you did with USAID, and they're not undoing it. It's not working right now. So for God's sakes, let's not play for a negotiating position as if we're in the middle of some 1985 negotiation between Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. The house is on fire. And Schumer and these other guys are like, this is a great opportunity to make some s'mores. But the
Right.
house is on fire, and it's time to get up and say, how do we stop them? Where do we stop them? Why aren't there 1 million Americans in the street every weekend like there are in Belgrade or in Budapest or in Tel Aviv, who are all protesting against, by the way, a global movement of ethno-nationalist, white supremacist, anti-globalist, anti-democratic governments? Putin, Netanyahu, Orban, Trump, Milei in Argentina, Modi in India. This is a global fight that the United States of America, which people expected to lead this fight, is now switched sides. We're on the other side.
I want to get to the people in the street and why there are so few. Now, we have seen spot demonstrations, that's what I'm going to call them, but not mass demonstrations. And I talked to two people, one a reporter and another a very well-placed Democrat, in the last couple of weeks. And I said, where are the governors? Where are the Democratic governors? I had heard that J.B. Pritzker, the governor of Illinois, had said, everybody come together. I'll gather everybody. Let's get together. Let's figure something out. And the Democrat was like, well, if they do that, they're afraid that it will give everybody an opportunity to just tee off on them. And also they're afraid that if they do that, that Trump is going to cut their funding. And then what happens? And then the reporter said, oh, yeah, he tried that. And they all said, no, we're not coming. And so to my point is he's going to cut off whatever it is you care about anyway.
Yes. Wake up. All these law firms, a couple of law firms he threatened with executive orders, and the other law firms should have at that moment immediately stepped up, said, we will fight this tooth and nail. He's going after universities. And although a couple of people in universities have stood up and said, we're going to fight it, most university presidents have been, we've got to protect our funding. He's going to take your funding anyway. You are exactly right, Reed. He is going to come after you anyway. That's the house on fire, that you can't manage him into rationality. He is crazy. He is malevolent. The people around him are malevolent. Elon Musk is a white supremacist, pro-Putin, neo-Nazi,
Pines for the days of apartheid, right?
drug-taking guy who somehow has us on the side of apartheid. I mean, Trump is like, let's save those white farmers in South Africa, as if that were a priority. But where'd he get that? Obviously, he got it from Musk. But the point is, you're absolutely right. And it is time to say, come what may, this is like men who go off to war. We have to be willing to make the sacrifice, whatever it takes,
Yes.
to fight for and defend this country. And, I have a business, and I know they could come after my business, and maybe they will come after my business. And I sat with my wife and I said, look, if that happens, it happens. But if we don't fight now, my dad was a Holocaust survivor. I know what happens. He and his parents got out, but 40 members of his family, all the aunts and uncles and cousins, they were all slaughtered. This has happened before. And one of the things that I find so striking is how many Americans still believe it can't happen here. It is happening here.
So I watched this incredible movie called, I think it's called Lee. It's about Lee Miller. She was a fashion photographer in the 30s and actually became one of the first female war photographers during World War II. And she's being in the movie. Kate Winslet is brilliant as usual, and she's being interviewed by this young British reporter. And he said, "How did it happen?" And she said, "Well, it just one day that there it was. One day the bombs were falling, right? Like it was weird. Hitler was crazy. France was gone and the bombs were falling. It just sort of happened." And I think that's, I don't know I remember who the quote is. Nothing happens, then nothing happens, then nothing happens, then everything happens. Well, everything is happening, gang. Everything is happening.
Look, I wrote an editorial in Foreign Policy magazine in 2015 saying the biggest threat the United States faces is Donald Trump. There have been people who have watched Donald Trump since the 1980s who said he's pro-Russian, he's crazy, he's out of control, he's a fraudster, he's a criminal. Don't give this guy power, including, by the way, his mother.
Right.
And so it is predictable. I was at a restaurant in Washington the other day, and one of the people there run the restaurant. I was talking to her, and she was from Rwanda, and she was talking to her mother, and her mother said, "I'm worried about you." And she said, "Why?" And she said, "Because what's happening there, I remember. That's what happened here." And I thought to myself, here is a young woman. She was 25, 30 years younger than me. Here is a young woman whose family went through the Rwandan genocide, for whom this is not a remote idea. They lost people. They died. My father went through this. We all know people who went through this. It is not remote. And yet we can't bring ourselves to say it's happening here. There was a kid, a Georgetown student in Roslyn, Virginia, yesterday or the day before, walking down the street, grabbed by ICE and taken away. His visa taken away. Why? He had the temerity to offer pro-Palestinian views. There are a bunch of people who got put on planes and against a judge's order without any due process. They didn't get deported, which means sent back to their home country. They got sent to a third country and put into a hellhole of a prison from which they may never get out. And we already know a bunch of them were not what they were accused to be. And so we are losing these rights all around us right now.
We used to call that rendition. Remember when the CIA did it?
Yeah, right. Except there was at the time a modicum of due process, around it. And when they were doing it, when Bush was doing it, we were protesting. Now this is a gajillion times worse, and we're not doing it. And this is the problem with Chuck Schumer. Let's wait and see. Till when? Till when do our families have to be in railroad cars heading for a camp again before we say, oh, this has gotten too bad, we have to fight back? Because that doesn't work. We've tried that.
Well, and you and I are lucky enough to get to do the things we do, right? Even in these times. And maybe we're privileged to be able to do these things in these times.
And it is not a sure thing that we will always get to do them.
Right. But let's talk about how we go from the x-axis of politics, right? From left to right or progressive and moderate, all right? And the y-axis of politics, which is you and I get to spend, we're lucky enough to spend a lot of time up here, but down here at the bottom of that y-axis, at the 0 point, right? That is where actual humans are getting hurt. When you talked about Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. You saw that last week, the Ag Department cut off about $1 billion in aid to local farmers to provide fresh fruit and produce to schools and everything else. Just today, as I was reading, another $500 million gets cut from local food banks. The first thing I think is not how awful that is, but Jesus Christ, David, we live in the United States of America. Why do we have food banks, right? Why is that a thing? But here now real people are going to be harmed. To your point about the Department of Education, look, if you asked me to tell you what the Department of Education did on any given day, I couldn't tell you. But here's what I know. There is an assault on education. There is an assault on public education that is to the detriment of individual Americans who will only leave them further and further behind, if such a thing is possible, in a place where now they will be dependent 100% on a regime that does not care about them. And that to me is like, how do we start to wake these people up and say, I'm not asking you to go to the street right now. What I'm asking you to do is pay a little bit more attention. And if you're willing to do that, now those people who can, and this is what we're talking about at the union, if you can help your neighbors, go help your neighbors, because they're the ones that are going to need it right now.
Well, first of all, you don't have to wake up the people who are suffering. They know they're suffering. What we have to do is we have to recognize that the political movement that is going to end Trumpism, and MAGA is going to be grassroots driven. And it is going to be driven by the stories of people who have suffered. Right now, other than a handful of billionaires, there is not a person in the United States who is not being hurt or will be hurt by this administration. Many people in many ways. Prices will go up. People will lose their jobs. Roads and bridges that take you in and out of town will never get finished. Food programs will not be prepared. Cancer research will stop. Programs to help the people who have healthcare needs will stop. People will die. People will die in the VA. You talk about the Department of Education. It's hard concept for somebody to understand what it does. But if your kid is disabled and had to go to school on a school bus funded by that federal program, and they can't go to school anymore, you've got a story to tell. And we've got to go and capture those stories and get those out there and turn that into a movement. And look, the last time Trump was president, every election that followed that, MAGA lost. You know why? Because he was a terrible president, and 1 million people died of COVID.
Right.
Okay, 1 million. And the deficit exploded, and our standing in the world faltered, and people got it. Except now it's happening mega times over that. I spoke to a colleague of mine who is in Montana right now, and she went to a town meeting. People were outraged. Half of those people were registered Republicans in the reddest state in America. And that should tell you where the leadership is going to come from, because it's going to happen at town council meetings and city council meetings and community meetings and in local elections and at school board level, where these people are going to stand. This is why Republicans can't go to town halls anymore. It's not because politicians are going in to confront them. It's because people who are hurting are saying, you've got to stop Doge. You have to stop Elon Musk. And wait till a little later this year, when all this bullshit is a predicate to a tax cut for the rich being extended. And these people say, oh, their taxes are going down, but mine aren't. But my services are going down, and I'm suffering as a result of this. That's where it's going to happen. And so, my message to anybody out there who's listening, and if they're listening to you, they care, is, if there's a big demonstration in Washington, you want to go to it. You want to support national candidates, support them. But go to your town council meeting, go to your school board meeting, go to the meetings with your neighbors, and stand up in solidarity with your neighbors and let them tell their stories. Because the stories of the victims of Trumpism will be the end of Trumpism. And the stories of their aspirations need to be the inspiration for the future of the Democratic Party.
Well, and I would say for the future of the country.
Of course.
Because this is one thing that I feel very strongly about, is this idea, right, that these the folks that we're talking about, and I met lots of them on the road this fall, right? They were sold an idea, and it was a lie. But it wasn't just Trump lying. It was all of us. We all lied. Do what you're supposed to do, and you can get ahead. Do what you're supposed to do, and you'll find a job. Do what you're supposed to do, and your kid will have a better outcome than you do. And you know what, David? It's been bullshit. It has not worked out that way. It has worked out for a few, but not for the many. And this group in this time, these folks who we are already organizing, we are already talking to, this is one thing I hope your fellow Democrats and our Democratic friends will understand. There must be a countervailing force. There must be a countervailing idea. There must be a countervailing belief. Just saying we're not quite as bad, or everything's okay, or I'd like to go back to the thing that didn't work for you in the first place, is a ridiculous, sort of veil of nostalgia that we shouldn't acquiesce to either. As you said, like, the future's that way. The train goes in only one direction, and we should decide where we want the tracks to go.
That's exactly right. And we have to do it within the rules that are actually going to work. So if your first reaction is, you know, let's get rid of the Democratic Party and start a new one, that's not going to happen right now. So the first thing you have to do is you have to change that party from within. The Republicans did this, right? Remember the Tea Party movement? You can go in because of where our system works and get 15, 20, 25, 35 seats and all of a sudden control the future of the Congress. And so there is a possibility for a Democratic, forward looking, responsive to the moment, next generation movement, a caucus for tomorrow, the Tomorrow Caucus in the Democratic Party. And we ought to stop pretending that what we're doing is working, okay? Because if Joe Biden hadn't been so fing selfish, um, we might have been in a different position here. But we were deferential to him and we were deferential. We picked this bland dude to run the Democratic National Committee, and he's not going to fix it. And we need a change. I'll tell you one last story here. I have two daughters. They're both in their early 30s. They both went to good schools and thank God are healthy and married and, have great jobs and so forth. And they're starting to, be at the age where they have kids and they're really invested in this kind of thing. And my older daughter called me up the other day, and I say with some pride at people who listen to our podcast now, my older daughter is the senior writer, the only woman senior writer on the John Oliver show.
Oh, cool.
So she's very busy and very successful, and I'm very proud of her. And she called me up and she said, Dad, there's something I think you could do. And I was like, what? Like I could do something? Because I long ago felt useless after I stopped dropping them off at school. And I was like, yeah, okay, what can I do? And she said, well, you're there in Washington, you're connected to everybody. And I said, yeah. And she said, well, could you make it so the Democratic Party stops sucking so much? And I was like, that's exactly right. The Democratic Party sucks. And, the people are like, oh, don't criticize the Democrats. It'll only help the Republicans. Bullshit. If we don't criticize the Democrats, we're going to only keep losing to the Republicans. We've got to change. We've got to have the courage to change. We've got to find a path forward where we can win in 26 and win in 28. We've got to have the lawyers there to fight every effort that they make to suppress the vote, put their thumb on the scales in the elections. And we've got to be willing to do whatever it takes, however big the demonstration it is, whatever the words we need to say. But we've got to stop with the mealy-mouthed old school politics that got us to this continuing resolution, that got us where we are. It's time for new leaders, time for new strategies, time for new policies. And I got to tell you, I'm super heartened that here you are with this platform sending that message out.
No, listen, again, I'm not a Republican anymore. Not going to be one. Not a Democrat. Probably not going to be one. But we fought on the same side for, 5 years now as far as, actually fighting Trump in an electoral perspective. And we've all been at this since the guy came down the escalator. Hard to believe, almost 10 years ago this summer, David. But it's not enough to say it's bad. You have to be in opposition. And I'll just tell you, the sort of resistance porn I'm over, right? Like I get it, right? But you're not really resisting just being on YouTube every day, right? You actually have to go do something.
Stop with the social media posturing. Don't tweet or blue sky that Trump is being hypocritical. He's always hypocritical.
Right.
Don't say he's lying. He's always lying. Please don't use bullshit terminology to show that you went to school and say he's a stochastic terrorist. What the folks? That's not going to motivate anybody. Look, I'm from New Jersey, and I apologize for all the F-bombs in my conversation. But, maybe sometimes we need a little New Jersey in the conversation.
Amen.
We need a little bit of directness in this conversation. We shouldn't say, oh, we are drifting towards authoritarianism. We should say he wants to be a dictator. He is behaving like a tyrant. This is acting like a police state. Use words that are full of meaning because they generate urgency.
A friend of mine told me, David, that I have Trump derangement syndrome. And I said, guilty as charged. If believing that he wants to do all the things you just described, it makes me a victim of TDS, fine. I don't care.
Trumpists created this idea that being strongly anti-Trump was a disease, when I can tell you, Reed, so you feel better, it's a sign of mental health.
Right.
If you don't have Trump derangement syndrome, see a doctor.
All right. Well, on that note, David, where can we find your work? Where can we find your podcasts? And where can we find you online?
Maybe we shouldn't be so free with putting that out there.
They're already listening.
Yeah, no, I know. Well, we run something called the DSR Network, and we've got a bunch of podcasts, but we do, 15 podcasts a week, including the New Republics podcast, the Daily Blast, our own daily. We do several deep dive podcasts every week. And so you can go to Deep State Radio, the DSRnetwork.com. I have a Substack called Need to Know, which I strongly encourage everybody to sign up for, which complements this other stuff we do. I'm on MSNBC periodically and, out there giving talks and so on and so forth. And we'll continue to do that. And I have a book that I'm working on because I, come from a certain branch of Judaism where if you're not working on a book, you're wasting your life.
Amen. All right. As always, gang, you can find me on TikTok, Twitter, Blue Sky, I think, at Reed Galen, on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA, on Substack, also the Homefront here on the Homefront. Guys, two more things. One, I need you to go to jointheunion.us, get involved in the things that Dave and I were talking about at the local level. We're already doing that. In fact, we've got some town hall meetings coming up as early as next week that I'll be able to tell you a little bit more about on the next episode. And go to SaysUs.us, the social media network for sanity, if there is such a thing. David Rothkopf, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Reed.
And everybody else, we'll see you next time.